Western world is currently declining on multiple levels and is heading towards an inevitable collapse within our lifetimes. In the first part of this video, I've already talked about this topic in general and discussed two of the five primary reasons why the West is collapsing. An untenable economic welfare system based on debt and political polarization and civil unrest. Today, we'll talk about the other three reasons, namely the mass immigration of barbarism, the death of civil liberties, and the emasculation of society. As with the first part, some short disclaimers are in order. The following topics are unfortunately deemed controversial and might offend those of you with thin skin. Please close the video and go away if you're easily offended. Due to the prevalence of censorship here on YouTube, I've had to modify the video's contents from its original written form, seen on my website, escapingthewest.net, or in my book. If you want the uncensored version, please find the links below. And finally, if you're interested in this kind of content, interact with the channel in the usual manners. It helps a ton. Let's get started with the third primary reason why the Western world is collapsing, the mass immigration of barbarism. In January 2015, two brothers entered the Paris offices of the French satiric magazine Charlie Hebdo, armed with assault rifles. They killed 17 people, mostly journalists, who committed the heinous and unforgivable crime to publish cartoons about Islam. A second and related series of attacks a bit later caused even more senseless death to innocent people. Instead of rising up in vehement and outraged protest against yet another heartbreaking tragedy, the French people professed sympathy and preached love and solidarity. Politicians made a lot of empty promises and vacuous speeches, but less than a year later, nothing had changed, of course, and a series of coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris caused the death of at least 130 people and injured more than 350. A few months later, across the border in Germany, celebrating the 2015-2016 public New Year's Eve celebrations, in cities such as Cologne and Hamburg, over 1,200 women were sexually assaulted in public and gang raped by groups of North African and Arab men. To date, only 4 of these men have been convicted. On March 22, 2016, 3 suicide bombers blew themselves up at the Brussels National Airport and in a crowded metro station in Belgium, killing 32 people and traumatizing hundreds of other innocents, some of whom later killed themselves. It took 6 years before 9 jihadists involved with planning and executing these attacks were put on trial, all the while costing millions in legal fees and housing, and the trial itself had an estimated cost of 42 million euros. Who paid for this? The government, funded by the people, the taxpayers, the victims. Years earlier, 2 radicalized terrorists planted homemade pressure cooker bombs during the annual Boston Marathon, which killed 3 people, injured hundreds of others, of which 17 lost limbs. 3 days later, these men killed a policeman and severely injured 2 others, one of which died later. For decades now, religious terrorist attacks have been part and parcel of life in Europe, and to a lesser degree in Canada and the US. And every once in a while, societies get rocked by a stabbing, shooting, bombing, or beheading. Politicians express their regrets and vow to never let this happen again. But once the initial public outrage dies down, nothing happens. And the same pattern occurs again and again. I might offend some people in the following part, so if you have thin skin, I suggest you fuck off. This is the main premise, which I wholeheartedly challenge you to disprove. The mass immigration of mostly unemployable young men from vastly different and culturally incompatible, often Islamic countries has been a complete and total disaster. It has brought about a myriad of destructive problems and is a severe threat to the cohesion and survival of the West. One might say that the West has been importing part of its own demise, and one might not be too far off the mark. Before we go on, let me make it perfectly clear that I have nothing at all against people moving to another country to be a productive member of that society. Positive immigration is the kind of diversity that makes life interesting. Hell, The whole purpose of this channel and related media, such as my website, is to encourage people to move to another country, but not to be a leech on and a danger to that society, which is what is happening in the vast majority of cases in Western nations. And sure, a good argument could be made for taking in and helping actual asylum seekers, for example, escaped ISIS sex slaves. That's the humanitarian and humane thing to do. Although this immediately raises the question of why exactly it is the responsibility of the West to take in these people and add to their already overburdened social welfare systems, and not of richer, closer by nations with a similar culture, such as Saudi Arabia or Qatar. But I will leave this moral conundrum up in the air for now. In any case, do most refugees fall into this category? Overwhelmingly not. They're mostly young men who come here not to escape a crisis, although those are certainly present, but who are economic refugees, people who just want a part of the Western pie. Let's look at some numbers first. Over the last decade alone, this is the amount of immigrants who entered, legally or most often otherwise, the following Western nations: Germany, 14.6 million; France, 2.4 million; United Kingdom, 24.5 million; United States, 11 million. These numbers are larger than the total population of some European countries. In Europe, the unemployment rate of these young men is high, almost always in the double digits. And this is not even surprising. How can you be employed if you have no marketable skills, do not speak the language, and, most importantly, have a clear incentive to not work? As mentioned in the previous video, refugees are almost always beneficiaries of government benefits. Public housing, a generous allowance, freedom to import the rest of their family, healthcare. What's not to like? You, as the tax-paying citizen of a Western nation, have to pick up the bill in more ways than one. Slowly but surely, Western culture is being destroyed by large groups of people from other cultures who often adamantly refuse to blend in. In many countries in Europe, there are enclaves where even the police do not dare to go anymore. Completely off limits, no-go zones, often home to dangerous criminals, a breeding ground for terrorists. Are those people native to the country they are living in? Almost overwhelmingly not. In almost every single case, these are Muslim enclaves where they employ their own set of rules based on Sharia, brainwash the next generation, and slowly but surely chip away at the foundational values of the country they reside in. In the United States and Canada, this isn't such a large problem. There are, of course, plenty of refugees and immigrants from, say, South America and Asia, and they, of course, bring problems with them, as do natives and immigrants from elsewhere, of course, but nowhere near on such a vast and incontrovertible scale as is happening in Europe. Think about the following rhetorical questions, which are based on real events, real traumas, and injuries people had to go through because of the import of barbarism. Do you like getting stabbed, shot at, beheaded for drawing or even talking about cartoons of some fictional character? Do you like getting mass molested in the RAPE game by a bunch of men in a public place on New Year's Eve? Do you like having to watch what you say, tiptoeing around real issues out of fear of offending Muslims or the zealous, irrational mob defending them? I certainly don't. Do you like getting run over by a truck, blown up at an airport, kidnapped, or receive credible death threats? Do you like feeling unsafe in your own country with parts that are completely off limits to you? Or how about the Muslim pedophile child groomers who operated in Rotherham, England for many decades, unimpeded, even though the police were aware of what was going on, yet were too afraid to be labeled a racist to intervene? Sure, I'm cherry picking a few out of many thousands of incidents which occurred on European soil in recent history, all perpetuated by Islamic migrants. And yes, the majority of Muslims abhor such actions and would never commit such acts. Yet, they believe in the same doctrine and values these criminals do, and by bringing this culture onto European soil, they too are indirectly responsible. No, scratch that. The ones responsible for the mass immigration of barbarism onto European soil are the European citizens themselves, by voting for incompetent and weak politicians who endorse such policies for years on end, afraid to speak their minds so they won't be labeled an ist or a phobe. And it's too late now. The cat's out of the bag. Barbarians were at the gates, and instead of being repelled, they were welcomed in, given a home and funding, even while pillaging the village and ravaging the citizens. And the West is now enjoying the sour fruits of this near boundless generosity by slowly losing its culture, safety, and well being. We've arrived at the fourth major factor of why the West is declining, and one of my personal pet peeves, the death of civil liberties. In 2018, a Scottish man made a video of his dog, which he trained to raise its paw upon hearing statements such as "Gast Juice" and "Sieg Heil" to annoy his girlfriend. He uploaded the video to YouTube to the amusement of millions of people. An innocent joke, something silly to make people laugh? Of course not. The police were alerted and the man was arrested for committing a hate crime. The host of InfoWars, Alex Jones, a notorious conspiracy theorist, was brought to court in 2022 for falsely and foolishly claiming a school shooting a few years earlier was a hoax, as was his formally constitutionally guaranteed right under the principle of freedom of speech. He had to pay a total of over $1 billion in damages. During the 2022 Academy Awards debacle, host of the night, Chris Rock, made a joke about actor Will Smith's wife, as was part of his job as a comedian, tasked with bringing some amusement to a rather dull and self aggrandizing affair. Instead of laughing off the joke, Smith went up on stage and smacked Rock in the face, a man half his size, before going back down and throwing some verbal abuse at him. Instead of getting kicked out by the organization or booed by the hundreds of people in that room for committing assault on live television and violating someone's right to free speech, later that evening, Smith was granted an award, upon which he proceeded to launch into a hilariously ironic speech about being an ambassador of that kind of love and care and concern. During the 2019-2022 pandemic, caused by the virus which shall not be named, governments all over the world imposed severe restrictions on their citizens and heavily cut into their rights, such as free movement and association, freedom of speech, privacy, and so on, in the name of public safety. These restrictions have imposed a heavy toll, not only on the already heavily overburdened economies of the nations, but most significantly on the individual welfare and prosperity of its citizens, with many losing their jobs, getting into arguments over the restrictions with former friends and family, businesses going bankrupt, legions becoming depressed and lonely due to forced solitary confinement, and everyone facing a rather drastic increase in their cost of living. According to the Cambridge English Dictionary, civil liberties are the right of people to basic freedoms and to live without the government becoming involved in private matters. In other words, guarantees and freedoms that governments shouldn't breach, which are usually defined in constitutions such as the Bill of Rights in the US. They include things like freedom of press, freedom of assembly, the right to privacy, right to life, the right to defend oneself, the right to equal treatment under the law, and of course, freedom of speech. In short, I would say it comes down to having personal freedom and not having the government meddle in what you can do. In the West, you do not have much personal freedom anymore. A good case can be made that you never actually had it, because governments are always antithetical to freedom. But there were less restrictions in the past, and the adherence to the constitutions was at least upheld with a veneer of legality. You might feel like you do have plenty of freedom because you've been living under this yoke your entire life and you conform to the currently appropriate and accepted way of thinking and acting. But by moving abroad, your personal freedom will increase tremendously. For now, let's focus on freedom of speech, the bedrock of Western civilization, a core value, a proud achievement, something we could rightfully boast about. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union went up against each other in many arenas: the arms race, in space, global influence, and so on. But the US had something the Soviet Union did not have, and of course still doesn't: the theoretical freedom to say what you want. In the US, you could freely insult the president and not expect to get dragged behind a shed and shot in the head. It still happened, of course, but not as prominently or publicly. Likewise in Europe and Canada, where a person's right to express him or herself was sacred and clearly emphasized in most constitutions. In theory, journalists could write and publish what they wanted. Private persons could speak their mind, and all of this was of paramount importance for a working democracy, and the population, by and large, wholeheartedly supported this concept and was outraged when it got violated. Have you felt like you could say anything you wanted lately? Do you think you can still publicly express yourself and the way you truly feel if your ideas don't align with how the masses dictate you should feel and think? If so, you haven't been paying attention to the way the Western world has evolved, or you've simply conformed to the currently acceptable opinions. For example, a couple of decades ago, it would be unthinkable to go to jail for something you said to a stranger, let alone for something you merely thought about, or to get fired or fined for something you posted online, or for opinions you shared in private, or for something you meant as a harmless quip, which gets taken out of context. Now, thought crimes apparently exist, and people can and do get arrested, punished, and or assaulted for something they said, be it in earnest or as a joke. What makes this so much worse is that this situation is apparently approved of by the population, or at the very least by a minority of very vocal, rabid social justice warriors. The majority of people might find this abhorrent, but their lack of public disapproval implies silent consent, because the situation is allowed to continue. Freedom of speech is an illusion in the current Western world. It only exists for currently and generally approved opinions, which can change rather rapidly. Be very careful with what you say online, because what might be okay to say or think today might not be anymore in a few years' time. This leads us neatly to the latest atrocity in this area: cancel culture. People are not only getting vilified and publicly shamed for something they said, wrote, or implied, sometimes even decades ago in a private setting, but are often forced to resign or publicly grovel for it. As a few examples, Gina Carano, an American actress and mixed martial artist, was fired from her role in Disney's The Mandalorian after she posted a story on Instagram comparing the current political climate to Nazi Germany. In a hilarious and ironic reaction, completely proving her point, Disney, which was founded by and still holds the name of an actual Nazi supporter, immediately cut ties with her, stating that her social media posts denigrating people based on their cultural and religious identities are abhorrent and unacceptable. Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, for many years the quintessential liberal celebrity, received harsh backlash and public defamation after expressing beliefs about gender, sex, which do not align with the currently accepted opinion. A staunch reporter and champion of leftist beliefs in the past, Rowling was nonetheless eagerly set upon by the very people who lauded her just a short while earlier. And I'm sure you can think of a dozen examples of this nonsense off the top of your head just in the last few years. There's something horribly wrong with this current climate of sensitivity and vitriol towards people with a different opinion.
While the truncheon may be used in lieu of conversation, words will always retain their power. Words offer the means to meaning, and for those who will listen, the enunciation of truth.
Do you hate people with a different skin color and like to express your thoughts about this online and try to persuade others into following your ideas? You're a piece of shit, in my opinion. But freedom of speech means you have the right to be a piece of shit. As Oscar Wilde put it, I may not agree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to make an ass of yourself. Nobody should ever have to go to jail or be harassed or fined or made to apologize for what they say or think, regardless of what they say or who takes offense to it. a principle the constitution of many Western countries was based upon. That, however, is not the case anymore. Again, the United States leads the charge in this deplorable descent into censorship with their political correctness. This expresses itself in many ways. There are certain words which are banned from civilized discord, such as
an uptight buster, you old horny slut!
or any other denigrating and derogatory term a supposedly free people deems inappropriate, depending on who actually utters the word, of course. Instead, they get covered with euphemisms, soft language, as if saying the N word changes anything about the meaning and connotation of the word it represents. On public television, these and many other things, curse words, are bleeped out. This is censorship and it is childish, divisive, and harmful to the healthy conduct of a free society. Make no mistake, every single Western nation is guilty of this. Freedom of speech is nothing but a lofty ideal, praised in theory but abhorred and banned in practice.
How did this happen? Who's to blame? Well, certainly there are those who are more responsible than others, and they will be held accountable. But again, truth be told, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror.
Who's to blame for this? Again, you and I are the culprits. Well, perhaps not we personally, but the public in general, both for this ridiculous behavior and for the tendency to vote for politicians who support such behavior. Who determines what you can and cannot say? How does anyone else have a claim to what you are allowed to utter, regardless of the contents of your speech? What makes them so special and qualified to determine which words are accepted and which are not? If you start drawing lines within what is allowed and what is not, the censorship will never end. Freedom of speech must be absolute. You have to be able to say, write, or think whatever you want, even if it offends other people, even if it is stupid, racist, homophobic, sexist, whatever. It does not matter. If you aren't free to say whatever you want, without the fear of getting censored, fired, or cancelled, you do not have freedom of speech. And if you don't have freedom of speech, you aren't free. The late Christopher Hitchens, an eloquent, erudite, and vehement champion of free speech, sorely missed, put it this way. The only thing that should be upheld at all costs and without qualification is the right of free expression. Because if that goes, then so do all other claims of right as well. Unfortunately, as you can tell, this is now the case in every single Western nation, and the right of free expression is being put under qualifications and is slowly but surely being eroded under the guise of protecting the public. At least the Russians and the Chinese are open about their censorship. Now, I have to make it clear that in many other countries I would advocate moving to, you have even less freedom of speech about certain things. For example, in Thailand you cannot publicly defame their king. But do you care that you cannot talk shit about the Thai king? However, my point is not so much that this situation is better in other regions, because wherever there's a government there are restrictions, but more that in the West, freedom of speech and other civil liberties were a core value and used to be part of the bedrock of our civilization, which is not the case in other countries. And their crumbling is a sure sign of the impending collapse. And now finally, let's get on to the final point, the emasculation of society. Back in 2017, 4 male employees of the news website BuzzFeed tested their testosterone levels to gauge where they fell on the scale of male attractiveness. Testosterone, if you didn't know, is a hormone which, basically, makes a man a man. It gives a clear indication of sex drive, aggression, body frame, muscle mass, and has a definite influence on things like ambition and focus. The usual testosterone level of an adult male ranges between 270 and 1070 nanograms per deciliter, with men between ages 25 and 34 around an average of 617. Not one of the men who tested their T levels even came close to this average. all of them fell below the level of a typical 85-year-old. These results weren't surprising because, aside from the fact that left wing, socialist type men tend to be weaker and more effeminate, the general level of testosterone in the average male in Western societies has been decreasing substantially since the 1980s, with an average of around 1% every year. For quite a few decades now, a deviously concealed foe has been plaguing the Western world: the decline of masculinity and subsequent quality of men. Ever since the 80s, 90s, modern society has been eroding, corrupting, and weakening men, turning them into a pathetic and severely diminished version of their ancestors. It is an insidious threat, a silent killer that will inevitably lead to destruction of society as we know it. Make no mistake, a country without masculine men is a country doomed for extinction. And the problem is, most people aren't even cognizant of how destructive this really is. Compared to the other factors we've talked about, the emasculation of society isn't seen as a big threat by the majority of the population. In fact, if they're even aware of it at all, it's usually applauded. However, I would say that almost all factors which are leading to the collapse of the West are in some way or form connected to, or even caused by, the decline and vilification of masculinity. To end the video, I'll put forward another highly inflammatory topic, certain to alienate and infuriate a large portion of modern audiences. Here goes. A successful society is built mainly by the efforts of strong masculine men, and if those become rare, extinct, or just plainly not wanted anymore, that society is doomed. This irrefutable fact hasn't been very popular lately, and there's even an active, yet mostly covert and hushed campaign going on against masculinity. Examples of this would be things like rebooting formerly male led movie franchises with an all female cast, leading to box office flops, over the top girl power everywhere in modern entertainment, while simultaneously denigrating and coming at the expense of men, forcing men to apologize for doing and liking masculine things, such as trying to seduce women without the fear of being reported for harassment, or joking in private about inappropriate matters, tearing down statues of once great men because they were a product of their time and, for example, had slaves, claiming that it's okay for a man to be a fat, out of shape slob instead of realizing his masculine physical potential, and so forth. Basically, Western society is by and large demonizing being a manly man, using terms like toxic masculinity, mansplaining, and the patriarchy, and getting close to stating that everything masculine is evil, while conveniently leaving out the fact that masculine men were the ones who built this society and the comfort and freedom it currently provides. Ironically, the freedom to be an anti masculine man or woman was provided by masculine men, where once contemplative thought, fearless integrity, and unbound masculinity were valued above all. We now have a culture of instant gratification, incessant hollow outrages, microaggressions, and a rapidly feminizing male population, seen, for example, in the decline in testosterone levels. And the worst part, again, it is completely our fault.
You need only look into a mirror.
Only men are to blame for the sad state of Western society and the people in it. Now, you might think that our society has evolved so far beyond the biological need for male strength, and that we don't actually need manly men anymore. That it's okay to have a male population which is overwhelmingly weak, physically and or mentally. However, there are several ways the result of this train of thought is dangerous, extremely detrimental, and definitely responsible in large part for the collapse of Western society. If a society constantly tells young boys that it's okay to be feminine and wrong to be masculine, both directly and indirectly, for example, through advertisements such as the 2019 Gillette commercial, which framed masculinity as a problem, you will get more feminine men with lower testosterone. This causes, first of all, a plethora of issues in their own life, such as a lower drive to excel and succeed, less motivation to actually do something with their life, erectile dysfunction, problems attracting women, lower self esteem, less muscle mass, a lower sex drive, much lower happiness, and so on. Generally speaking, this leads to unfulfilled lives, both professionally and personally. Feminine men are, by and large, unattractive to women, unless they're rich, which causes rejection, frustration, and resentment with the still horny men. They start to feel disillusioned with life and society in general. Men who constantly have to tiptoe around sensitive subjects and watch what they say, out of fear of offending someone and becoming publicly ostracized, demonized, or even penalized, become mentally weak, cowardly, and less resilient. If they are unlikely and afraid to speak up for what they actually believe in, and they let themselves be pushed around, they're very likely to vote for safe and accepted politicians and policies. These bring about deterioration of civil liberties, such as less freedom of speech, more welfare for all, and the importation of barbarism, because men are afraid to speak up against it, afraid to be called an ist or a phobe. Men from stronger, more masculine cultures find it very easy to take over a society where most of the males are weak. And this is exactly what is happening in many parts of Europe. All of this leads to the fact that there's a steadily growing group of disenfranchised men who are giving up on the society which deems them unwanted, either retreating into their solitary comfort zone and finding solace in video games, porn, and arguing with strangers on the internet, joining spiteful and often violently misogynistic subcultures, turning to unsavory outlets to vent their frustration and anger, or, in the best case scenario, moving to places where they are accepted for who they are, leaving the West and its emasculating culture far behind. And of course, that leaves Western society in the hands of effeminate, weak men, a sure sign of the impending collapse. I'll end the video with a quote from G. Michael Hoff, which prettily encapsulates the point I've been trying to make. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. And weak men create hard times. And rest assured that hard times are coming. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts. Do you think I'm full of shit? Tell me. Tell me why. Bring arguments. Or do you agree with what I talk about? And are you planning to leave the Western world? Let me know in the comments below. I will see you in the next video.